Now, Donald Trump's peace plan calls for Hamas to lay down its arms and no longer have any role in running Gaza. But while the militant group has been weakened, it is still in charge in the territory and reluctant to give up power.
Hamas on the streets of Khan Yunis. After 2 years of war, still there, still armed, and still in charge of much of Gaza. In areas where Israel's military has withdrawn, Hamas says it's hunting down people suspected of collaborating with the enemy. And there have been clashes with other armed groups as it seeks to reassert its authority. The group has taken serious hits. Its senior leaders have all been killed, both abroad and in Gaza. Its backer, Iran, finds itself weaker, and regional allies Hezbollah in Lebanon have been all but destroyed. Yet Hamas has been able to recruit almost as many fighters as it has lost. It still has weapons and an extensive tunnel network to operate in Gaza, and it's embedded in Gaza's healthcare and education, part of the fabric of the administration. U.S. President Donald Trump's Gaza peace plan sees no role for Hamas. It does offer amnesty for Hamas members who hand over weapons and renounce violence. It calls for governance by a Palestinian committee to be supervised by a so-called Board of Peace chaired by Trump himself. That committee will hand over government and security to the Palestinian Authority, the group that administers much of the West Bank. Hamas's military infrastructure, including tunnels, is to be destroyed, and it specifies that Israel will not occupy or annex Gaza. Many of the plan's points leave crucial details to the future. Hamas does not want to hand over all of its weapons, and the plan doesn't say who will be responsible for destroying tunnels and other military infrastructure. There's also the problem of the Palestinian Authority and its 89-year-old leader Mahmoud Abbas. He's an international favorite, but the PA is widely seen as corrupt and weak and enjoys very little support among Gazans. In the meantime, while Israel patrols its own border with Gaza, a multinational force led by the U.S. is supposed to monitor the ceasefire. For how long is also unclear.
Let's take a closer look at those points with Miri Eisen, an expert on Middle Eastern geopolitics at Reichman University in Herzliya and a former Israeli army colonel. Welcome to DW. Thank you so much for joining us on the programme. Does it concern you that, as we just saw there, Hamas seems to be already working hard to regain control over Gaza, even though the peace plan says the group should have no future role there?
Well, it's similar in that sense to Hezbollah in Lebanon with all of the differences. Hamas was never destroyed. It was never decimated. It was always there. And there was always that question of what would happen the day after. So I'm certainly not surprised. The question is how both Israel and the international community, and especially here in the Middle East, are going to assess that problem. Will Middle Eastern forces from Egypt, from Qatar, or from any other place around here, the Arabic-speaking ones, try to restrain those rifles that you're seeing right now? All of them are threatened by Hamas's capability, and all of them have stood up for this plan presented by President Trump that calls for Hamas to be disarmed. The only ones who have said something about that, perhaps to keep Hamas in power, are only Qatar. Even Turkey has said that Hamas as a power needs to be disarmed. Nobody's saying Hamas will disappear. We're talking about those arms, about that terror capability, about what they started on October 7th as a terror organization.
Who, if anyone at all, would you say is in a position to actually convince Hamas to give up power?
Only Qatar. And I think that only Qatar in that sense is the one that actually brought them to the table right now to give back the 20 live hostages. And I expect of Qatar to be the one to make Hamas bring back the additional 24 bodies they have not brought back. It's as if there's a difference. This is just a ceasefire. Hamas have not yet implemented the first stage of the ceasefire, which was that they were supposed to give back both the 20 live hostages that they did, but also the 28 bodies, and they've only given back 4. And I know that people see a difference between that, but the only ones that have impacted them until now, not the United States, not Egypt, it really is Qatar, perhaps Turkey. That's where a lot of the leaders are power nowadays in Turkey. They're the ones that need to put Hamas in its place, have them step back, because otherwise, I say sadly, I mean, it's a horrible idea. This could continue, and nobody wants that except Hamas.
Let's say Hamas were to disarm. Isn't there then a risk that a power vacuum could open up, one that other militant groups might rush to fill?
You know, you're posing it as a question which I so respect, and I say, what are the alternatives? The last thing anybody in the world wants, let alone Israel, is that Israel to control it. And in that sense, when we're talking about other viable Palestinian leaders, you and I both want to see that. It should not be somebody that Israel defines. It should be something in that sense that the Palestinians or the international community, the Middle Eastern leaders define. That again, it's not about the arms, it's not about killing Israelis or destroying Israel. It's about the reconstruction of Gaza, of giving them a better future. And I want to hope that for them. And I want to hope that, A, we in Israel, with a government that I think in Israel can be very extreme, won't obstruct such a thing. And I want to hope we won't, but that the international community, that's not Europe, it's the Middle East, it's Egypt that borders the Gaza Strip, it's Jordan, it's Qatar, it's the United Arab Emirates, it's Turkey, that's not an Arabic-speaking country, that all of these ones from this area would impact Hamas and make sure that there's a viable leadership that could be there instead. It isn't something that Israel can impose, and we should not impose it. And I'm going to hope for the Palestinians there. They've gone through horrific 2 years, as have Israelis in a very different way. But those horrific 2 years, they deserve a better future, and I hope that we can find one for them.
So you use the term of viable leadership. Can you identify any Palestinian leader committed to peace with Israel who could realistically take charge of Gaza?
Thank you for the question, because you started with committed for peace with Israel. I love the term peace, and I am all for peace. I'm willing for somebody who's just willing to recognize my existence. And I say that because in the last 2 years, that aspect of this war has been the delegitimizing of us, Israel, as being allowed to exist at all. So in the Palestinian Authority, in the West Bank, there are such voices, and I'm willing to accept them as I say that. I think that there are 2 additional voices that are in Israeli jails that were not let out. These are people that were arrested over 20, almost 25 years ago in the Second Intifada when they instigated terrorist attacks against Israelis, were put on trial and were put in jail, and they weren't released right now in this these different prisoners that were put on trial and inside Israeli jails. They were not released. One of them, Baraguti, there's another one also there. So there are viable names. At the end, it should not be not Israel. I would even say not the United States for sure. It should be their own voices. But as you said, a voice that is willing to recognize me. Peace is a lot to go down the road for. This isn't about reconciliation yet, but at least to recognize our existence to be able to take this a step further.
You haven't mentioned the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas. Could he fill that unifying role? I mean, we have to note here he hasn't faced an election in 20 years, and of course his administration is widely seen as corrupt. But what would you say to that?
So as mentioned before, I think by the correspondent, the Gaza Strip, nobody looks at Mahmoud Abbas as a leader, but I need to take it a step further. The younger generation in the West Bank does not recognize Mahmoud Abbas as a future leader. So here we have the crux of that two-edged sword. Israel, should not and cannot define who will be their leader. And I really would not like them to choose a leader that is going to call for my annihilation, for my destruction. And I do think that there are voices that are in between. As I said, they may not like me. We're not going to be best of friends. It isn't about peace and reconciliation, but they're willing to accept our existence. And there are such figures both in the West Bank. I don't know of such figures right now inside the Gaza Strip. Let's take it a day at a time. First, to really try to rebuild something in the Gaza Strip to give the people there a future. And I completely understand that Israel is the one that has destroyed physically so much inside the Gaza Strip. I also think that the Palestinians need to find a future which does not include calling for our annihilation.
You say it should be taken a day at a time. How much, though, is time of the essence here? I mean, how quickly do the next steps of this peace plan need to happen in order to keep up the momentum?
If you look at the pictures that you showed before from Sharm el-Sheikh from yesterday, where world leaders all came together, you would have noticed that Israel was not there. There's a lot of speculation going on in Israel right now about Israel not being there, about Netanyahu both being invited by Trump, by not coming. But I'm saying that because at the end, we do have a very strong impact. Still at this stage of the ceasefire, it's still only a ceasefire. We, Israel, with our military forces, are still in a large portion of the Gaza Strip. We're still in and around the perimeters, and we need to leave it all. But to do so, they definitely have to bring back, the Hamas, the 24 additional Israeli hostages that were taken from their homes on Saturday, October 7th, some of them killed in captivity, some of them killed on October 7th and held as bodies. These need to come back. That's a compulsory stage to be able to go forward in Israel realigning, redeploying outside of the Gaza Strip. There were no troops inside the Gaza Strip from 2005 by Israel. There have been very violent confrontations. Israel did not conquer the Gaza Strip in the past. And I think that, and I say taking one step at a time, I want to hope that what we will do is see those 24 hostages dead, but hostages coming home, and then Israel will realign outside, and that will allow the reconstruction both from the Egyptian border that they share with the Gaza Strip, but Israel is along it right now. We need to realign from there, and then to allow the different Arab states. And again, it's not about Israel redoing it. The Palestinians don't want Israel to do anything, and to let those Arab states, the Muslim states, be the ones that reconstruct.
Colonel Miri Eisen, thank you so much for your time today. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Burjuaz Celik is an expert on the region's security and political issues, and she's a Middle East analyst at the Royal United Services Institute, joining us today from Cologne in Western Germany. Welcome to DW. With Hamas so deeply embedded in Gaza's society, how would you say there can be a future without the militant group in the Strip?
Well, thank you for having me on today. I think just to start off, to note what a momentous day it was yesterday, and to continue to hold out some hope that this will stretch into a more sustainable ceasefire. That said, and as your report laid out very well, there are more questions than answers, and that there is a lot of space for diplomacy in the coming weeks and months, I think, is a given. In these kinds of ceasefire agreements, often the absence of detail is very deliberate, because it then allows key stakeholders to negotiate and firm up the details behind the scenes, which are very difficult, especially for a conflict that is as protracted and intergenerational as this one between Israel and Palestine, and of course the war over the past 2 years in Gaza. So it's very difficult to be able to say with a high level of certainty today what the future looks like for the disarmament of Hamas, but it is a momentous, a very challenging task indeed.
What other groups are trying to expand their influence in Gaza right now, given this focus right now on pushing Hamas out?
There are other factions, armed groups. Palestinian Islamic Jihad is the most well-known or recognizable one. There have been also groups, armed groups, that have been backed or allegedly backed by Israel in the attempt to diversify the provision of security in Gaza and to isolate Hamas. The extent to which that strategy will hold, will be sustainable in the longer term, of course, again, is another unknown. But certainly the concern is that without Hamas, there might be a security vacuum, and which armed actors will fill that security vacuum. And what that will mean for the safety of Palestinians in Gaza, of course, is paramount. We still have the very real necessity of distributing emergency humanitarian aid, much needed, of course. So that is a question, and that ensuring that aid is not diverted by armed groups like Hamas and others for their own ends and their financial survival. So it's going to be very difficult. There is now, again, competition over who takes over from the areas in which Hamas has pulled out. But again, Hamas does still retain significant political and security control over the population in Gaza. Yes, they have been degraded substantially over the past 2 years. But what's important to emphasize is that these kinds of disarmament processes we've seen in other post-conflict scenarios, they must be presented and negotiated as part of a wider political settlement. So to speak about disarming Hamas without situating that within a wider set of incentives and sanctions against the organization, and without a wider pathway towards Palestinian statehood in the longer term, I think that's going to be very difficult to reach that kind of reach the goal of disarmament without the wider political questions being addressed.
Most of the credit for the current ceasefire has gone to the US President Donald Trump, but which regional players currently have the biggest influence on the situation, and do you see them working together to keep this moving forward?
I think we've seen over the past 2 years an incredible level of cooperation and interregional coordination to help arrive at this point. And certainly President Trump has pioneered this, and the US is very much behind the 20-point plan. But we mustn't forget, of course, the agency and the diplomatic back-channeling that has been underway by actors like Egypt, by Qatar, by other Gulf states, as well as Turkey. I think in the final days ahead of the ceasefire agreement being announced by President Trump and Mr. Netanyahu, it was very clear that those actors who have a stake and who have an ongoing line of communication with Hamas, such as Egypt, Qatar, and Turkey, were influential in finally incentivizing Hamas sufficiently to convince them that this hard and incredibly painful, traumatic leverage that they kept holding on to, and that Israeli hostages, it was time to let that go. And I think now it's very much dependent on regional actors, as well as the United States, to continue to put pressure on Hamas to comply with the terms of the ceasefire, and likewise with Israel as well, because there are these very codependent and mutually reinforcing terms in the ceasefire. Israeli withdrawal from Gaza is very much dependent on Hamas's disarming.
Broad Chelik from the Royal United Services Institute, thank you so much for your time today.